People are talking a lot about inequality these days, about the fact that the richest 1% have so much more than everybody else. But most of the focus seems to be on the United States, and it strikes me that the same story needs to be told about global inequality too. So I did some research, and this is what I found from reliable sources like the UN. It turns out that while the US is totally out of whack, things are actually way worse for the planet as a whole. Let's start with this graph. A perfectly even distribution of wealth among all living people, with everyone divided into 5 equal groups. Now, let's show how much each group actually has. Shocking, right? 80% of the world's people barely have any wealth. It's hard to even see them on the chart. Meanwhile, the richest 2%, they have more wealth than half of the rest of the world. Let's look at this chart another way. Let's take the whole world's population, all 7 billion of us, and reduce it to just a representative 100 individuals. Here they are, poorest people on the left, richest people on the right. Now let's show how the world's total wealth, roughly $223 trillion, is distributed. The vast majority have practically nothing. Nothing with which to educate their children, nothing with which to pay for basic medicines. While the richest 1%, they've accumulated 43% of our world's wealth. The bottom 80%, meanwhile, that's 8 out of every 10 people, have just 6% between them. But even this doesn't really show how extreme things have become. The richest 300 people on Earth have the same wealth as the poorest 3 billion. So the number of people it takes to fill a mid-sized commercial aircraft have more wealth than the populations of India, China, the US, and Brazil combined. We can also see this difference geographically, with a huge and growing gap between a few rich places versus the majority of the world. For most of history, things were much more equal. 200 years ago, rich countries were only 3 times richer than poor countries. By the end of colonialism in the 1960s, they were 35 times richer. Today, they're about 80 times richer. Rich countries try to compensate for this by giving aid to poor countries, about $130 billion each year. That's a lot of money. So then why does the wealth gap keep getting bigger? One reason I found is that large corporations are taking more than $900 billion out of poor countries each year through a form of tax avoidance called trade mispricing. On top of this, each year poor countries are paying about $600 billion in debt service to rich countries on loans that have already been paid off many times over. And then there's the money that poor countries lose from trade rules imposed by rich countries to get access to more resources and cheaper labor. Economists from the University of Massachusetts calculate that this costs poor countries about $500 billion a year. Altogether, that's more than $2 trillion that flows from some of the poorest parts of the world to the richest. Every year. Rich governments like to say they're helping poor countries develop. But who's developing who here? This makes me think that there's something wrong with the basic rules of the global economy. It can't be okay that the wealth of our planet is becoming so concentrated in the hands of such a tiny number of people. The only reasonable response, it seems to me, and our only hope, is to change the rules.
Well, that's a very good question, and fortunately, some mathematicians at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology have given us a very precise answer. They did a study of who owns and controls the companies on the capital markets, 43,000 companies, and they found out that there's a secret super entity, they call it, that owns 60% of the earnings every year and 40% of the assets. They did this by putting the same people on the boards of these companies. So they have 10 times the economic power that they're entitled to. And they thought no one would catch them at it. This is a huge conglomerate that has been rigging the LIBOR prices. It's been rigging all of the commodities prices. It's been trading in the securities markets with insider information. It has got to be stopped. It also bought up all the media and has been lying to people.
That's how our so-called fractional reserve system was born. In this system, the bankers get to make up money out of nothing, while the rest of us have to work hard to earn it. It has created a modern form of serfdom where the mass of society is now working to pay off their debt to the banks. Under this fractional reserve scheme, we inevitably become debt slaves to a ruling class of financial elite, not because they are better or smarter than anyone else, but because they have rigged the system to benefit themselves at the expense of most people on the planet. Catherine Austin Fitts is an expert on this issue. She was an Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President George Bush Sr., and then an advisor to the Clinton administration.
Let's set up a game of Monopoly and you want to buy Park Place. What I can continually do is just print money, give myself more money, lower the value of your money by printing more. No matter how hardworking you are or how successful you are, I can always end up buying you for free.
So how come if you or I make up money, it's called counterfeiting, but if the banks do it, it's increasing the money supply? How did the banks get this power? This is Jekyll Island, where in 1910, representatives from the Rockefellers, Rothschilds, Morgans, and other private bankers gathered secretly to draft the legislation that would create the Federal Reserve. Ed Griffin literally wrote the book on what happened at Jekyll Island.
Central banks are banking cartels which have gone into partnership with the respective governments in the countries where they operate. And they've been given monopolistic power over the creation of the nation's money supply. That's what the politicians handed to them as a gift, you might say, for the partnership. Now, in return, what do the bankers do for the politicians? They promise to create money out of nothing, now that they've got this legal power to do it anytime the government needs it.
And since 2008, we've witnessed the greatest fake money printing run in recorded history. This financial sleight of hand disguises the costs, hides who's to blame, and leaves us as debt slaves working to pay off the bill. I found it revealing that in the same year the Federal Reserve was founded, 1913, the Internal Revenue Service was also established. And income tax was then instigated so you and I would have to pay the politicians' debt plus interest to the bankers.
The problem is we have a privately owned central bank system in the United States disguised as a government-owned system. Now, if you look in the telephone book here in the Washington, D.C. area, you look up for Federal Reserve in the blue government pages, it's not there. It's in the white pages right next to Federal Express. It's a privately owned central bank.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. There is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take.
We have a private bank that prints money on behalf of the Treasury. The Federal Reserve prints money on a debt-based system which creates scarcity. But it puts a group of insiders in a position of having access to all the data about the economy when we don't. So you have a small group of bankers who understand the data on how the money works in the economy, and it gives them the ability to print money in a way that the insiders are protected and everybody else is drained.
Catherine went on to compare a healthy economy to a vibrant torus, balanced, freely flowing, and energized throughout, in contrast to what's happening in our current economy.
What you have is a system that's very dynamic, and it's trying to optimize. But intertwined in the core of it, you have a tapeworm. The way a tapeworm works in your body is it injects a chemical into your body that makes you crave what's good for the tapeworm and bad for you. You have a parasite that's very much manipulating and engorging itself at the expense of the whole.
We live in a tapeworm economy where the financial elite are the tapeworm and they're feeding on us. And they don't like it when people blow their cover. After Catherine began exposing government corruption at the highest levels, the FBI raided her company and seized its assets. She was dragged through the courts for 10 years before being found innocent. So we've got the Federal Reserve, a privately owned corporation with a monopoly on creating money, but with no accountability, backed up by a government with a monopoly on force. The country got sold on the Fed as an institution that would help stabilize the economy and remain independent of politics. But in fact, in close to a century of existence, the Federal Reserve has done just the opposite. Since they took charge, we've been robbed through inflation, and the purchasing power of the dollar has declined more than 96%. And the wealth gap makes it clear most of the money is going to a very few. Only 16 years after the Federal Reserve was in power, America experienced the Great Depression. My research revealed that before the big crash in 1929, the elite bankers pulled their money out of the stock market. After the crash, they used that money to buy up cheap stocks and smaller failing banks for pennies on the dollar. Among the bankers who consolidated their wealth this way were the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and Morgans. A similar scenario played out in the 2008 financial collapse, with the same bankers benefiting. In the years leading up to the collapse, the biggest banks, including Bank of America, Citigroup, and Chase, controlled by the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and Morgans, were bundling and trading bad loans that they knew would eventually fail. It's like putting rotten oranges in a box and selling them as grade AAA. The bundlers of the debt knew it was only a matter of time before someone would open that box and see that the content was worthless, since they were the ones who packed the boxes in the first place. When the rotten oranges, what we hear about as unsound loans, derivatives, and credit default swaps, were finally discovered, everyone was impacted. People lost their homes, their jobs, their businesses, and their retirements. Meanwhile, the biggest banks who created the problem in the first place were the ones who got bailed out. Why's that? Why would the Federal Reserve give trillions to the banks, even though the majority of Americans were against bailing them out? And why not help those most in need rather than the perpetrators of the financial collapse? My research led me to believe that the same people who created the Federal Reserve, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, and the Morgans, still control it, and they use this scheme to bail themselves out at our expense.
Many of the banks created are still the most powerful lobby on Capitol Hill, and they, frankly, own the place.
I'm convinced that the near collapse of the economy in 2008 resulted from an orchestrated pump and dump scheme designed and executed by the big bankers to consolidate wealth and power. David Icke explains how he sees the Federal Reserve rigging the so-called business cycles.
Stage one, it's like throwing a fishing line out. Stage one, you put lots of money, units of exchange, into circulation. You do this by pushing interest rates down, by making lots of loans. This is the part of the cycle we call a boom. Because there's lots of units of exchange in circulation, there's lots of money changing hands. That generates lots of economic activity. That generates jobs. And as more and more money is spent, there's more demand. So companies take out more loans of fresh air money to increase their production. People get confident in their everyday lives. Hey, you know, I work for this company. They've got lots of orders. It's really going great. My job's safe. I tell you what, we can have a bigger house. Then they start to change it. what they do is they pull the fishing line in. They push interest rates up. Now, fewer people, are taking out loans, and they make the criteria for having a loan from the bank stronger anyway. And also, now, as interest rates have gone up, a larger part of people's income is going to pay back the extra interest and not being circulated in buying things. Suddenly, there's nothing like as much money in circulation, and therefore, fewer things are being bought. Companies start to go down in terms of their profits. They start to shed jobs, and they start to go out of business. People lose their jobs. They can't pay the mortgage anymore of the big house they took out in the good times. Now what the banks are doing is starting to reel the fishing line in, because as they go bankrupt, companies and individuals, the banks get the real wealth, the property, the land, the resources that they had signed to them for lending merely figures on a screen. Now, this economic cycle of fishing line out, fishing line back, lots of units in circulation, pull them in, has been going on for centuries. And what it's done, it's stolen and accumulated the real wealth of the world in the hands of the few.
At the international level, central bankers use the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to make more money while exploiting the resources of countries they lend to, bankrupting them in the process. The central bank of central banks is the Rothschild-created Bank for International Settlements. The elite are positioning themselves to control access to virtually everything we need to survive.
No matter where you go in the world, the money is controlled by the banking system. They decide if people eat or if they don't eat. Who's a billionaire and who lives on less than $1 a day? He who controls the money controls the world, and a very few control the money.
At this point, my view of the world had been turned upside down. I was struggling with the realization that the failure and suffering of so many is actually success and fulfillment for a few. The elite central bankers who fooled the world into letting them create money. They already have vast fortunes, so what is their end game? What is their ultimate agenda? I kept running across compelling evidence and credible experts saying that the secret agenda of the banking elite is nothing less than total global domination. At first, I resisted the idea, but I was committed to finding out what was keeping us from thriving, no matter where it might lead. One night I woke up at 3 a.m. with the burning question: if this small group wanted to dominate the entire world, what would they need to control to accomplish it? I jumped out of bed and started making a list. First and foremost, they'd have to control money, and they do. Controlling money allows them to run everything else. They'd need to control energy, and they do. They already control big agriculture and world trade. They're buying up water supplies worldwide. They've got health in their pocket, and they're trying to suppress natural alternatives. Mainly, they'd have to control what information we'd get and how we'd react to it. In America, the internet, our greatest tool for communication and grassroots organizing, is currently not controlled or censored, but its open status is being attacked from all sides. Governments, corporations, and the United Nations are all attempting to take control. For complete domination, dissent has to be controlled. They'd need to take away our rights, spy on ordinary citizens, and track every aspect of our lives. As the day dawned, I knew that a powerful elite had almost everything set up to rule the world. And I had the frightening realization that Big Brother is not just coming, he's here now. We are already in the Matrix. So how do we get out? To envision that, I realized I needed to discover what their ruling structure looks like and how it works. A relatively small group of families, especially the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, Morgans, and Carnegies, along with the Harrimans, the Schiffs, and the Warburgs, have been leading the controlling elite in the West for generations. I'm not implying that every individual in these families is aware of or active in the global domination agenda. However, I'm convinced the heads of these dynasties control the corporate and banking interests that carry out the sinister scheme that is destroying so many lives. Those secretly driving the agenda have been known by many names. Leaked reports confirm that they meet throughout the world behind closed doors to discuss their agenda. Then, like clockwork, their plans begin to show up in the media, finance, corporate, government, and military arenas. Of course, not everyone involved in these groups is in on the decision-making. There is a hierarchy of knowledge and participation. One of the primary symbols of the controlling elite is the all-seeing eye. It's on the dollar bill. It's on the American mass surveillance system initially called Total Information Awareness. It's on the British intelligence agency MI5. And it even oversees the Supreme Court complex in Israel, designed and funded entirely by the Rothschilds. I believe they've taken the majestic image of the Cheops pyramid and its legendary metallic capstone and perverted the meaning to represent those at the top being able to track and control all those under them. One of the painful ways this information has been used is by people who want to promote anti-Semitism. They wrongly call this a Jewish agenda and continue the ongoing racism that undermines and destroys so many lives. Let me be clear, this is definitely not a Jewish agenda. It's been documented that central bankers even funded both sides of World War II, as well as some of the corporations associated with Hitler's atrocities against the Jews. Since these people have more money than their families would need for generations, and since they have the power to create money, I don't believe wealth is their end goal.
After you have all the material things that you could possibly want in life, what is left to excite you? And for many people, the answer is power, global power. They became intellectually elite. They began to think that they had a plan that was better than anybody else's plan. They got the idea that freedom is dangerous. If you give people freedom, you know what? They're probably not going to use it wisely like we think they should. We are smarter than they are. And for their own good, we should rule them.
As I came to accept the idea of a ruling elite planning for total global domination, I began to hear these same people actually talking more boldly and publicly about it, only they call it the New World Order.
When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this New World Order.
It is a new world order with significantly different and radically new challenges.
A new world order can be created. It's a great opportunity.
Given the condition of our world, a new world order can sound like a great idea. But I had to distinguish between what I was discovering about global domination, a one-world government run by an elite few, and the reality of our global interconnectedness, which is the realization that at a fundamental and even spiritual level, we are not separate, we are all connected. But the agenda for global domination is really the exact opposite. It's a divide and conquer strategy to keep us all pitted against each other, thinking that it's the Democrats or Republicans, the liberals or conservatives who are the problem, when both parties are ultimately serving the same plan. I believe we're heading toward a totalitarian world authority, actually a military dictatorship run by a tiny elite who have all the power and make all the rules. If they succeed, there'll be nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Think about it.